Today we're going to go over the best decks in the Set 13 format, going over every single nation and the top decks that saw a lot of good performance throughout the competitive season in Japan. Set 13 is finally out in English, and of course its tournament legality is about to begin as well, so now is the perfect time to break down all the best decks that are in this set. What's more, as we do know that from January 19th you'll be able to play 4 more cards in the main deck. With each of these archetypes that I show you, I'll also include some suggestions in terms of what other cards you can put in, as the list I'll be showing you will be the 46 card main deck ones of the present format. We're going to start off with Dragon Empire, and of course Jiva got a lot of support in this set and finally became a somewhat real deck. I want to show you 2 variants. This first one is a much heavier cross overdress variant with 2 arcs in it. So Jiva's big support in this set, of course, is the new Prayer Dragon package, which is mainly turned on by Aparagia. Aparagia says when it's placed on rearguard circle outside from the deck, so like let's say from drop zone or from hand, you can Soul Blast 1 and discard a card from hand to search your deck for any Prayer Dragon and call it to rearguard circle. So that's really good because this allows you to run some of your Prayer Dragons as one-ofs that you can just search out of the Aparagia. On top of that, when this becomes an original dress, you get to draw a card, and the outer dress of this unit gets the effect that until the end of your opponent's next turn, it cannot be selected by opponent's abilities. So that's really good because that finally gives you an answer to some of the big retire matchups. It's also going to be big into the Shironi meta once the Stride deck sets come out. And of course, the card draw is also very welcome. That's why we're seeing some of these other Prayer Dragons as one-ofs. Nandika here, when it becomes an original dress, lets you Soul Blast 1 and effectively give a Battle Door effect to the outer dress, which is really good because your Varinas are going to be attacking usually twice a time. There's also the Dorahas, which when placed on rear, as long as you have a Vanguard with Nirvana's name, lets you counterblast 1 and retire another rearguard to search your deck or drop for up to 2 total Blazing Heavenly cards, so they're of course Prayer Dragons. Pull them to rearguard circle as a rest, and if you retire the rearguard in the cross overdress state for this cost, you get to draw a card too. So this is pretty good as just a one-off because it allows you to basically extend and fill up your board very easily to go into a new win con, which is Straverina. Straverina has to be cross overdressed by using 1 Trickstar and 2 or more Prayer Dragons with different names, so that's why I run so many different ones here. And he has 2 effects, and front row rearguard circle is the first one, which is during your turn, as long as he's in the crossover dress state, he gets plus 10k power, and your Nirvana Vanguard gets triple drive and plus 10k. Unfortunately, it's not drive plus 1, which means that even if you bring out 2 Straverinas, it will not stack. And the second effect is that when he stands by your Vanguard's ability while in the crossover dress state, as long as your opponent's Vanguard is on grade 3 or greater, you get to counterblast 1 and stand all of your Talisman or Prayer Dragon rearguards. So all of your arenas are Talisman, so they are going to stand, and Prayer Dragons will stand too. So even if you call some Prayer Dragons as boosters, it's basically a full board restand. And if Straverina has 5 or more original dress, then you remove all markers from your opponent's rearguard circles and retire all of your opponent's rearguards. You rarely go for that much. Usually you just go for the 2 or more Prayer Dragons instead, and then effectively you only really go into the markers against something like Magnolia Masks. But this is a very good card because it pairs really well with Mirror's Verena, which of course gives you the ability to countercharge or draw a card every time it attacks, and therefore you can, get 5 attacks out while either adding cards to your hand or countercharging and reusing your costs. Overall, Jiva is still a pretty heavy parts reliant deck, but we've seen quite a few tops pop up here and there, and so usually people either use a couple of arcs to kind of just give themselves a bit more draw power in the early game, or as we see in the second variant, we see Vil's Verena as well, which is another Verena target, and it also has of course that ability to resist and get back your Verenas, because sometimes once you run out of your Straverina, you really need to get it back somehow, and that is one of the options, but I often do see it played as like a 2-of instead. But you will notice that the second list only runs 3 Jivas, so here we can already make some suggestions, right? We also see the Trickstar starter, which in the first list it was the Dragon Egg or Surprise Egg starter. So in terms of the extra cards, you can see that maybe we can play an extra Grey Luminar here. You can also again get your 4th Persona Ride in here. You have space for a Regulus piece, like either the Persona Ride one or the Transphere. You could even add other extra Prayer Dragons if you want to, and even make Trickstar be 4 in the main deck and then put in the Surprise Egg too. So there's quite a few ways to fill up the 4th card here. Now the second Dragon Empire deck we're going to look at is not as exciting, but it is a repair version of Gandiva. So of course Gandiva got hit not too long ago, but I still wanted to feature this list of course, which uses the new support of the Brave Altine, which is basically just an extra extender, but you can see how people are making space for other cards here. And so because of course Gandiva will also get 4 more card spaces, you could use that space to, for example, max out on your best harvest, play an extra copy of the Blitz order that we see here too, which I'm a big fan of, and even put in more of the grade 2 cycle card as well, to give yourself more of an out against matchups like Bastion Accord. Now the big surprise top for Dragon Empire is actually Shojo DOI. So I made a video previously that I highly recommend you watch, in that a lot of people thought that this meta would be all about aggro, but in reality it's a speed tier meta where we have fast speed tier decks, we have mid speed tier decks, and slow speed tier decks. And some of the best decks in the format, like Jeweled, are slow speed tier decks that lose to fast speed tier decks like Shojo DOI. So I'm not going to go over and break down Shojo DOI from scratch, but Shojo DOI is a very fast deck, especially thanks to the ride line that can aggress your opponent very quickly. And we see here, this person only runs 3 PGs, only 3 heals, goes for a super aggressive trigger lineup because the whole point is that you will always have less damage than your opponent. You're always pushing face so hard that the heals are usually not going to go off, and they basically cut out cards just to make space for more aggressive options. Now, Shenri is a promo that probably won't be down in English for a while, so you could run the 4th copy of the Shojo DOI promo instead, which should be out in English. So of course, this allows you to, when your other rearguard is placed on rear from bind zone, bind itself to give your unit that was placed 5,000 power, and if you haven't countercharged yet this turn, to countercharge, which is pretty huge because we do have quite a lot of CB skills we use just to call stuff or to search things from the deck. And in the bind zone, as long as you have a Shojo DOI grade 3 or greater Vanguard, when it is attacked, you can call it the Guardian Circle from bind zone, and it gets plus 5k shield. So it's a very good card that allows you to really just be super aggressive with this deck while still having some defensive options that just pop out of bind zone like that. But again, you do see here that a lot of cards are at 3 counts and stuff like that. So now, thanks to the 50 card main deck rule, I mean, you can see a lot of these 3-ofs that you can just bump up by 1 copy and suddenly make everything into full playsets. Moving on to Dark States, we have what is arguably the best deck in the format, or second best deck, or best deck of the slower speed tier at least, which is Jeweled. So Jeweled has been around for a while, but Jeweled Ignis brought with itself some incredible support for this deck. The boss card itself can only be ridden over a Jeweled, and at the beginning of your battle phase, he lets you put 2 cards from your drop to your soul, and then if you have 4 more different grades in your soul, so 0, 1, 2, and 3 for example, for that turn, he gives all your front row units plus 15k, so the power increase is also quite marginal. And he also lets you on attack Soul Blast 5 different grades, so 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, to retire all of your opponent's back row rear guards, and for that turn, he also gets a crit and puts all of your opponent's front row units to 0 power. What's nice is that instead of having Soul Blast 5 different grades, if you Soul Blast a Jeweled for this ability, you get to make the Jeweled count as any grade you want. So if you don't have enough like 2s or 1s or 0s in your soul, then the Jeweled can counter that, or you can also make it count as a grade 4. So this card already is very cracked. We immediately thought about how crazy this card is from the very first time it was revealed, and a lot of people thought that this would warp the entire meta. But turns out that Jeweled is actually in Japan after the release of the Stride deck sets and after the release of the Lyrical Booster, fallen off bit by bit, but it is still a super dominant deck that you have to know how to play against, otherwise you will get clapped. Because it just has so much good stuff going for it, right? Power increase, soul building, retire, extra crit, power to 0. Don't forget this deck multi-attacks too. And set 13 brought new cycle cards, which are grade 3s that support grade 4s. So they have a universal second skill that when they're discarded for the ride deck to ride into a grade 3 or for the cost of Stride, they will always draw you an extra card. But what also works really well is the first skill of the Noctargio here, which is when it's placed on Rearguard Circle or put to the Guardian Circle, you can reveal a grade 4 from your hand, and if you did, or if you have a grade 4 Vanguard, you do the following depending on which circle it's placed on. So if it was placed on Rearguard Circle, you can almost want to draw 1 and put 2 cards from drop to soul, which immediately sets up for your Jeweled Ignis Soul Blast cost. And the second is just a generic, plus 15k shield, which is also very nice because now this deck has even more defensive options. So that already helps you have a huge big consistency tool in Jeweled already. Not to mention that we have a grade 1 searcher that looks at the top 7 for your Jeweled, and even if you don't find one, as long as you can reveal a grade 4 from your hand, you get to just draw a card instead, so you're still CBing 1 for a plus. If Rokagur wasn't enough to restand your rear guards, we have the Vapura. So Vapura basically says that when your Vanguard would Soul Blast 4 more for its cost, you can put it to Soul from Rearguard Circle to draw a card, and then either reveal a grade 4 from hand, or if you have a grade 4 Vanguard, stand a rear guard, but you can only stand it if you haven't stood rear guards by ability yet. So you essentially have to use the Varpula first and then use Rokagur on its after, you check the timing for this guy. And then if that's not enough, we also have the Zagan. Zagan's fantastic in that he's a grade 2 that his second skill says as long as your Vanguards are Jeweled, he gets boost. So that's already very good for, boosting something like a Nocturgio. But when you call it to Rearguard Circle during main phase, you may soul charge 1, and then if you reveal a grade 4 from your hand, or if your Vanguard is a grade 4 Jeweled, you can choose a card from your soul that is a different name from this unit and grade less than or equal to your Vanguard and call it to rear, and then it goes back to soul at the end of the turn. So this is really good because if you soul charge, let's say a Rokagur, you can just pop it right out and then use it for the attacks. Same thing goes for like Nocturgio if you need that too. So it's really, really good. And we also of course want to run the Forbidol as our Regulus piece because it searches your Jeweled Ignis as well as your your Nocturgio, and you even have Ristal Galar here as an extra grade 3 that you can target. The big weakness of Dredgewald, of course, is it's going first grade 3 turn, because your Dredgewald grade 3 is not that good, and a lot of very fast decks, they can swing on you from their first turn, so therefore you're getting aggroed very hard against anyone that knows what they're doing. So if you want to be Dredgewald, just aggro it. Aggroing it usually will win you the game, and if you're on the receiving end, then you gotta resist that aggro as much as possible. It's gonna be interesting what happens with this deck when we get to the 50 card main deck, because we do have a lot more space now, because you can see it's a very tight, like everything is just like a 4 of. I don't know if playing more Ristal Galars is the correct play. You could play an extra one, but I'm kind of wondering if we'll see the return of something like Swirler, or maybe other forms of just building soul and consistency. Or maybe this allows you to finally open up space for more early game power, or maybe adding something like Inpusa as well. So that's just some of the suggestions. Even though I own this deck, I haven't actually thought too much about how I'm gonna add 4 more cards to it just yet, but this is definitely one of the decks you must keep track of for this format. Up next is a deck that of course saw some very big surprise tops in Europe, which is Greedon Masks. So Greedon Masks, of course, now has Battledore and a bit more consistency, and of course it doesn't lose until it hits 7 damage. But this is one of the highlights from the previous set, right? You put Battledore on your, all your attacks, and then you get to rebuild your field pretty easily, you get extra drive checks. Greedon sort of explains itself, but a lot of people still underestimated and thought that it wouldn't really be enough in terms of power level to really come out on top. But lo and behold, looks like it is still very strong, and this was one of the tops that happened post set 13. So there's actually a card in set 13 that supports Greedon, but looks like it is not being played just yet, but maybe some people from the European side will cook with this deck at Worlds. And since I didn't do a meta-analysis for set 12, we're going to include some of the big performers of set 12 in here too, and of course Amanagurugio is one of them too. I know this video is going to get pretty long because I'm explaining a lot of these decks that have never been featured before, but I feel like I'm doing a bit of a disservice, and it's kind of like 2 videos in one in a way, so hopefully that's okay for you guys. To explain Amanagurugio in a very simple way, it's a restanding Vanguard that basically minuses the amount of shield that your opponent's triggers have, and also disables the power increase of your opponent's defensive triggers too, through the power of Amanagurugio Masks. So the deck has been around for a whole set now, and there's been, quite a bit of consistency tools all over for the deck to succeed. And you basically just want to swap between the regular Amanagurugio and the Amanagurugio Masks as you kind of like rebuild your soul, rebuild your board, and rebuild your Vanguard basically. The big support that this deck got is the Lindalkia, who basically says when you call her, if you have a Vanguard with Masks in its name, you can almost want to look at top 5 for grade 3 or less with a different name from this unit among them, call it to rear, and then shuffle the deck. And then you choose a trigger unit from your drop and you may bind it, which is what of course Amanagurugio looks at as well, because she needs you to have bound triggers to disable your opponent's triggers. She also gets plus 10k if you have 3 or more triggers in the bind zone, so she's a strong attacker as well. So basically this deck just got another new tool added to it, but I'm thinking in case you get the new deck size limit upgraded, then you can add more of the generic cat, which functions as a countercharger and a big shield, and could even play a 4th copy of the Skull Kemda, including other units that could potentially support this deck too, though we don't necessarily see in this list. Moving on to Brandt Gate, one of the biggest winners of set 12 was Orist with Orist Masks, which went from being one of the most underrated decks on set launch in Japan to being one of the best by the end of it. Orist Masks, of course, allows you to dunk your world orders from the order zone into the drop in order to call Shadow Army tokens to occupied circles and also increase drive, so you don't actually lose cards from hand. The stand-up deck set gave you Palaxis Dragon, which essentially lets you set up your order zone a bit better and also draw you cards whenever you discard it or call over it. So in the case of Orist Masks, you would call over it. You can also go into Orist Masks even going first turn 3, so you don't activate the Persona Ride from the Masks effect, but you still get the very strong effect of getting extra drive checks and not losing out on cards from hand, which Aegis forces you to do. Some people might not agree with it, but I think that Solidar Stürmer is a pretty good card in this deck as well, because it gives you a very strong turn 2 aggro option. And Orist in general is a deck that you want to be very careful in playing because it rewards very careful planning from very early stages of the game. And so cards like Solidar Stürmer definitely reward you if you know what you're doing, and especially with the addition of the deck limit, you could even add more copies of the world orders to make sure you have higher hits, because of course now if you put in more non-order cards, you're gonna lower your chances of hitting the orders, simply because how statistics work. And you could also max out on Cyber Kaitsul as your mask searcher, because of course without the mask this deck doesn't really do as much because the Aegis on its own is not really enough. I think Opart is a very important card, but 3 Oparts feels like the right amount because it only really works once you are on the Orist Mask, so it doesn't really do too much in the early game. But overall though, you want to have a pretty strong early game, and then just kind of like depending on how how your hand looks, either stay on Aegis or go into Orist Mask on turn 3, and then usually try to finish the game by turn 4 with very powerful, overwhelming columns of Shadow Army tokens off of Orist Masks. The next Brandt Gate deck that got really good support in the set, as well as a recent promo, is Heroes. So Heroes are finally real after being a bit of a sleeper deck for a very long time, and they've gotten little bits of good support here and there, right? We got the Bold Saulos, that was like the, call itself when ditched for your base scout effect / scout stuff from drop. Like we got quite a lot of good little cards here and there, but it was missing that extra little oomph. We came really close with the Broad Felvis, which is of course the end of battle Soul Blast 1, pop itself to search your drop for a base and put it to order zone as a rest. So basically you'd be able to turn 2, get 2 bases out, which would compress your deck very quickly. And if you line up 2 of him, you could even get 3 bases out on turn 2, which is pretty insane. But the card that really makes this deck go is the Amas Darnia. So Amas Darnia, when she's placed on rear, if you have a B hero Vanguard and a base has not been put to order zone yet this turn, you get to Soul Blast 1 and discard 1 to search your deck for a base and put it to order zone. So what you can do is call Amas first, then set one of your bases from hand, and then use the promo to set the third. But what's more is that at the end of the battle that she attacks, if your Vanguard is a B hero and you have 3 or more bases in the order zone, you can almost want to retire her to choose one of your scouted cards and call it to rear. What's crazy is that you can call herself. So you can keep looping her and retiring her and get a lot of attacks out. It really just depends on how much counterblast you have. Because to begin with, this deck was doing 4 attacks thanks to the power of the triple rare from set 6 behind the Vanguard. But now you get to use Amas for a bunch. And of course, thanks to Persona Rides, the power is going to be pretty good. And that's not all, because the bases thin your deck so much of the heroes now that your deck is basically all triggers. So even if your opponent 2 passes you at times, you can just break through it pretty consistently. We run Valnod as the OT here because the Brandt Gate OT unfortunately is kind of awkward in this deck due to the way that you swap the columns at the end of the Vanguard's attack. And the blue OT is also fine, I think, but the red OT is really nice because you get to just put that extra 100 million on a unit that's going to restand and swing twice, and it can even be the one that gets swapped in from the back row by your grade 1 rearguard. So heroes are actually a very good deck and should be a very budget friendly pickup that is very, very sleeper meta in this set, I would say. So I would highly look into heroes if you're actually tempted even a little bit. Now a deck that unfortunately I can't say the same thing about is Agvangarda. Agvangarda has been supported here and there, and it's been doing pretty okay in the West, I would say. Now that you guys also have Ala D'Argente finally available is also nice. But in the set, we have Agvangarda Richter, who is the first reveal of the set actually, to the point that people even forgot he was in this set initially. So he kind of makes your Agvangarda swing 3 times, which is very good. So that first skill, of course, allows you to kind of like inherit the original effect, and then you get to do a bunch of Vanguard swings. But it's at the cost of a bit of hand, and you're kind of at the mercy of your own deck in terms of how much you sack. What is nice is the Asagi Milestone, who basically says that when she's placed on rear, if you have a blue Death Star Vanguard, you get to counterblast 1 and get an Agvangarda back from your drop to hand, and she also gets plus 5k as long as you've put a strategy card into your soul from order zone this turn. So combined, they do make this deck a little better, but you basically just have to sort of pray that your checks are pretty good with this deck. And unfortunately, the early game is quite restrictive too. Like you do have Hanada to help you, draw into cards, and Lloyd Azeus is kind of like a must-have now to just like find good cards while you're setting up your early game. But all of the Argente columns are going to be the main thing that are going to be swaying your games in your favor, and of course your Vanguard swinging 3 times is going to make her pretty huge too. And finally, my beloved Eva. She's also one that got unrestricted recently with Combined Rusher coming back, and this is one of the lists at top that I wanted to talk about a little bit. So Combined Rusher is at 2 because not only can we use him as an early game attacker sometimes, but we can also use him as a booster. Yes, you can use him as a booster because of the doc that we're still playing. You'll notice Greedon Research has been reduced to 3 copies because games don't go that long anymore that we get to pop 4 of them. Lloyd Azeus is an interesting option here, which I'm not super on board. I think the Blitz order from set 11 is a bit better. And you'll notice that grade 2 Obscurate is down to 2 copies here too, and I've seen this very commonly in the Japanese side. But there is quite a few things in the set 13 meta that just kind of clear out their own front row, particularly in the Japanese side where we had Maigo, which unfortunately English doesn't have just yet. But there are things like Heroes where oftentimes like they can just end on actually no front row. Bastion is like you can't even hit the front row if you don't Persona Ride with the grade 2 Obscurate. So like the front row attack of grade 2 Obscurate has become a bit less relevant, and we're more so just trying to loop grade 3 Obscurate nowadays and just kind of play this deck as something that just like traps your opponent at lower damage and just kind of bullies them out of the game. I think Eva still struggles quite a bit, but thanks to the addition of the 50 card main deck, this deck definitely has a bigger chance now. So I think we'll have space for actually maxing out both Obscudates potentially, space for the Blitz Order, space for Combine Rusher, and just in general any other good generics that come out after this. So Eva, I have high hopes for after the main deck size change. And now I think the deck that everyone wanted to hear, of course, Keter's Youthberg. Every Youthberg list in using 46 main deck cards is the same. They are all this. 2 Tempest, 2 Gust, 1 Zest, always 4 Full Blast, 4 Persona Ride. It's like all of these old cards that you know very well. And why is that, you're asking? Well, if you haven't seen what Full Blast does yet, it says when you Revolve Dress into it, you counterbust 1, and depending on which Revolve forms are in your soul, you do the following. And if you manage to do all 3 of these effects, then your front row gets plus 15k. So if you have Zest in the soul, he gets a crit. If you have Gust in the soul, he gets a drive. And if you have Tempest in the soul, he bot decks an opponent's rear guard. And optimally, you're trying to do this on turn 3. Going first, going second doesn't matter. But how are you putting them into the soul? Well, we have Fergosa, which is a grade 2, that when placed on rear, if you have a Youth Vanguard, which includes the grade 1 and 2, lets you Soul Blast 1, search a Revolve form, put it to your soul, shuffle your deck, and then if you have 3 or more different Revolve forms in your soul, then you get to Soul Blast a non-Revolve form to draw a card. So it's pretty good. That gets you actually to plus and also set up your Revolve forms, and she also gets plus 5k every time you Revolve Dress. But arguably the more important card is the Corino, who when placed on rearguard circle from deck or discarded from hand during your turn, as long as you have a Vanguard with Youth in its name, which again, the grade 1 and 2 are, you get to search your deck for a Revolve form or drop for a Revolve form, reveal it, add it to your hand, and then shuffle the deck, and then choose a card from hand, put it to the soul. So this is huge because you discard this for ride deck, you get to use it. If you use the grade 1 Youth skill to look at top 3 and call her, you get to use it. So setting up the 3 different Revolve forms in soul is very easy. Just search Zest first so you don't damage it and ruin your whole game plan. We run 2 of the Tolpas in this deck as well, just because it is an extender, helps you build board. I play this deck in tournaments a fair bit too because it's very straightforward. So sometimes when you don't want to like use up too much stamina and just like you have to play a lot of rounds, let's say like 8 rounds of Swiss, like Youth is a very good pick for that. I think with the 46 card rule, we're probably going to add another Zest as maybe just a little insurance. We finally have space for some other cards too, so I would honestly expect to see maybe more cycle cards potentially, just to kind of like give more defensive tools to this deck. Spiral Cutie suddenly becomes an option too. So I think for a lot of decks, like the answer is just like put in cycle cards. And I think Youthberg is definitely along the same lines. But unfortunately, the list just doesn't change too much. It's always basically this. And then we have Bastion. Finally, Sapien Owl is out in English. Congratulations, everyone. And now you have full power Bastion. And I'm also going to be uploading a Trail VGCS finals in which this list is played. So like literally this exact list I'm introducing, this was played by Yoku, who is a very popular and really cool player from China that lives in Japan here, and he's always performing super well. Just a great guy overall. But Bastion, of course, Bastion Accord came out last set, but we didn't feature it, so we'll quickly talk about it. He's treated as the Apex Bastion as well, and he gives all of your front row rear guards that are grade 3 or greater, plus 5k power, and the ability to not be chosen by abilities, which also works in your opponent's turn. So your rear guards are pretty big, that's why grade 2 Obscurity doesn't hit them anymore. And at the end of the attack that he battled, you can choose a grade 3 or lower rear guard of yours and stand it, and then as long as your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, you can also give it a skill once per turn that when it attacks, you can almost want to discard a Bastion from hand, and now this unit can drive check. So that has made Bastion a deck that can blow your opponent out very quickly, because just 2 chances of drive checking, you check a bit too many triggers, and oops, I can't guard anymore. Alden is huge. Grandor Edge Dragon is also huge and also a big shield. Counts as 2 grade 3s in hand, like what can this guy not do? But of course, the very important promo of Sapien Owl finally came out. I already introduced this in a Deer Days video, but for those of you that don't watch the Deer Days videos, this is just for you. Rearguard, hand, and trigger zone. This card counts as a grade 3 with 10k power as long as you have a Bastion Vanguard during your turn. And when you call it, if you have a Bastion Vanguard, you can put a grade 3 from your drop to soul and give your Vanguard plus 5k. And if you put a Bastion for this cost, you get to countercharge if you haven't countercharged. This means you can counterblast 2 with Alden to call out the Sapien Owl, then put a Bastion from your drop to your soul to countercharge 1, and then still use Form Up Chosen Knights for that same 2 CB. Do you understand how good this is? You can also use Bastion's attack skill too to just counterblast 1 and get drive checks. Really, really, really good. And what's best is that there's another support card for Bastion in this set, which is the grade 3 Cycler. As I mentioned in the jewel part, the second skill is generic, so it's the draw skill when you discard this to ride into grade 3. But when placed on rear or guardian circle, you can reveal a grade 4, or if you have a grade 4 Vanguard. When this is placed on rearguard circle, it gives 2 of your rearguards boost. So goodbye Dark Strain, we now have a very easy boost enabler. And otherwise, this is a 15k shield. And you might be thinking, what grade 4? Well, I'll remind you, Bastion Prime is a grade 4 in this deck. So now not only do you have the Grandeur Edge, that is a 10k shield, this is also a 15k shield. So suddenly, when Alden is going through all your CB and drawing cards, and you're like drive checking a bunch, or like form up Chosen Knights and Bastion Accords effect, the grade 3s you're checking aren't just like restanding blanks, they are now cards with shield most of the time. The only grade 3 without shield in this deck is Bastion Accord itself and Alden, and I guess Prime, but that's a grade 4. So the amount of shield cards in this deck suddenly went up by quite a lot. Bastion is going to be still really good in this set, so don't underestimate it. And the final Keter deck is Hexorb, which was mostly a highlight in set 12 rather than 13. The big support for it, in my opinion, is Delta Append Sorceress, who of course, when placed on rear, lets you Cannonball Blast 1 to look at top 2, put one of them into hand, put the other on top or bottom of your deck. But if you Persona Road, you can choose a crit or front from hand and just put it on top of your deck. So this basically does what the old Hexorb did as a rear guard. So it's pretty good, and we like it as an extra inclusion here too. And there's also the new cycle card Topaz, as well as the new grade 1 common that helps the deck a little bit too. So Hexorb still just kind of does what she does best, but now the new grade 2 definitely helps to boost it up a fair bit. And now Stoicheia. I get to talk about Leonor, which in my opinion is one of the fast speed tier decks that's really good. So I think for the English meta, the best slow speed tier deck is Rejeweled, the best mid speed tier deck is Youthberg, and the best fast speed tier deck is Leonor. And I highly recommend you read this set 13 Leonor guide by Jean. It is very well written, very easy to read, and it gives you matchup knowledge. It goes over different versions of Leonor that you can build, card choices, card ratios, trigger lineup, what ride deck is good, what ride deck you might want to consider, optimal boards, turn 1, turn 2. There's everything you would ever need to know about Leonor is all in this article. Please read it. And of course, while I've been talking, you've been seeing this list, and I play this list in tournaments a lot myself. It's a Mask Vivace hybrid. You have Luster Impact Dragon now in English too, which is one of the most insane cards in this deck that gives you extra draw power going first, can be used as a restanding rear when you don't have Rosarium Fairy on the board as well. Misty Arc Habitat is an insane card in this deck that sings your deck like crazy. And when we get to the 46 cards, this will only get better because you can play more of the grade 1 cat generic. You could play an extra Vivace in this. You could play a 4th Deathali in this. The ride deck is really important too because you get to go into the Roroa grade 1 to make a plant token, and then if you're going second, immediately Rosarium Fairy to kill that plant token to make a column of plant tokens. And now you have 3 columns turn 1 of 8k, 8k, 10k, and if your one is native defensive, they are melting. Turn 2, you get back one of your orders, so you can like turn 1 Misty Arc Habitat into a Rosarium, turn 2, get it back, fire it again, find a Depths Ailey that searches your mask for next turn, ditch the mask for ride deck, mask up immediately, and just go masks and win. What's crazy is that you can ride into Vivace after that, get the draw from going into Unison Dress, and then use the masks to still Persona Ride on top of that into the masks, draw another card, then banish your Leonor to basically get your like Rosarium back, and it's all really good. On top of that, there's also Elentis in this set, who basically functions as a countercharger and draw card that you can keep bringing back with Leonor Mask's banish skill, so it's just super good. Leonor Vivace herself is very good, but there's actually a different build that maximizes on her a little bit better. This is the Miltai version of Leonor, which he topped with in a couple events, and it runs a new promo which I think English should be getting very soon. So this is Keter, who when placed on rearguard circle outside of battle phase, lets you reveal a Unison Dress card from hand, or if you have a Unison Dress Vanguard, lets you Soul Blast 1 to choose a different named card from your drop from this unit and call it to rearguard circle as long as it's grade equal to or lower than your Vanguard. So that basically patches up one of the biggest issues of Vivace, where Leonor Mask is really good because she gets to revive something on top of pinging something on your opponent's board. And that was one of the big weaknesses. If you're sitting on Vivace and your opponent board wipes you, you just don't have any other way to revive your board. So Parcea actually kind of patches up that issue. And she also builds soul when you need it too. So she's a really good promo that will be coming out in English because she is a shop tournament promo. And as you can see, this deck is just bloated with grade 1s. So then Happy Dreaming Festa becomes insane because it's CB1 to basically call 2 of them. The only downside is that Rosarium Fairy loses out her best target, where Rosarium Fairy used to target the Luster Impact, copy the 15k power. So you'd be like 18k power from Persona Ride plus 15, 33. And if you put the Rosarium onto a Dragon Tree marker, it would be 20k. So you'd have 38, 38, huge Vanguard, 38, 38 with the Leonor masks. If this is confusing, let me know. I will make a guide for this deck because this has been my main deck lately ever since the competitive season in Japan finished, because otherwise I've just been playing my Go. But yeah, so there's a lot to break down in Leonor, and honestly, if you want to talk to me about Leonor, like, just hit me up. I love this deck so much. It's probably my favorite of all of the Will Dress decks, not gonna lie, like all the anime decks. And then the Stoicheia deck that I'm sure everyone wanted to hear me talk about is Mushi King. Nobody expected this deck to come out in English, but it actually did. So the way Mushi King works is that each of the bugs has an associated set order, which is the, well, they call it hitting attack. So in this case, the Tyrannus Tsuyakoagata is associated with the machine gun punches. Sorry, the Japanese name is much cooler. It's Hyakuretsuken. But basically, when, like, the bugs themselves are vanillas and they can only work from the orders that give them skills. So when your Tyrannus Stag Beetle attacks, you get to use the effective machine gun punches, and then you immediately give plus 5k twice, and at the end of the battle you can counterblast 1 to stand your Vanguard, give it -2 drive, and if you discard another copy of machine gun punches from your hand, it gets an extra drive, so it only loses 1 drive. And this pairs super well with the Zorga order from set 4 that lets you give an extra drive to your Vanguard for the whole turn. So you basically have an Overlord that is bug sized, but that's not all. We have the Super Tornado Throw attack that is working in conjunction with the Japanese Beetle. So the Japanese Beetle is a grade 1, but when it attacks, the Super Tornado Throw order gives it a total of plus 15k power. So it's a 23k attacker from turn 1, and you can also CB2 and discard another copy of Tornado Throw to let him drive check in case of emergency. So it's pretty crazy because you can just aggro your opponent down very quickly. And of course, the way that the Mushi King deck works and why you get these orders in the first place is that the grade 0, whenever you ride a grade 1 Mushi over, it gives you the Mushi King crest. And the Mushi King crest says that when you get it, you search your deck for up to 1 hitting attack, 1 pinching attack, and 1 throwing attack with different grades and put them into your order zone. And once per turn, you get to Soul Blast 1 till get top 5 for a Mushi or attack card and add it to your hand. And whenever your Mushi attacks, you rest an attack with grade less than or equal to your Vanguard in the order zone to use that card's attack. So on turn 1, you can use Japanese Beetle thanks to the crest. And then on turn 2, we have the grade 2 here, which is the Parry Stag Beetle. So Parry Stag Beetle uses the rolling clutch hold, which basically when that attacks, it gets plus 10k and lets you Soul Blast 1 to choose an opponent's rearguard, and it cannot stand during opponent's next stand phase, and cannot intercept either. And if you discard another copy of Rolling Clutch Hold, then you do that 1 more time. So this was really good during Eva meta because this would basically paralyze your Popskudades, and that would really hurt. But we only play 1 copy of it because we always want to be discarding for the grade 3 attack card. The grade 1 only sometimes when we really need that drive check, but the grade 3 is like always. You always want to be restanding your Vanguard. And so basically how this deck works is that you have your Vanguard and your Kabuto Mushi, and then usually your Mushroom is making plant tokens, and you aggro report in turn 1. You do that same thing turn 2, and that 23k Japanese Beetle is really painful. And then once you get to grade 3, you're using the Zorga order together with your attacks to have a restanding Vanguard whose first attack is triple drive and second attack is twin drive, and you just sack your opponent out of the game. This is a turbo aggro deck. This cannot win the long game. Your hand is usually also clogged with orders, so don't think about the late game, just go face. This is the Smork deck, but it's pretty cool. I think the collab decks add a very fun little element to the game, so I feel like everyone should own a Mushi King deck just for fun, as long as it's affordable, by the way. I didn't spend much for this. And finally, our last deck for this video, as it's getting pretty long, is Magnolia Masks. I know I've been forgetting to give you suggestions for 4 extra cards for some of these lists, like especially for Mushi King. I feel like it's just like add more attack cards, or I guess add cyclers to have more defense. But for this Magnolia list, you can see a lot of 3-ofs that you can kind of just like bump up by 1. The whole point of Magnolia Mask is that you make a bunch of Dragon Tree markers and then everything can attack and retire your opponent's front, like your opponent's whole board basically. And you use orders like Misty Arc Habitat to just like find all your pieces. We also run the common from set 13 that basically becomes a huge beater for each of your Dragon Tree markers. It gets plus 2k power, and for every 5 cards in drop it gets plus 2k power. So it just becomes huge, right? It's 15k base power as well, and it can only be called on circles with Dragon Tree markers markers on them. But Magnolia Mask itself gives all of your rear guards that are Dragon Tree markers plus 10k power and the ability to attack from the back row. So you just want to have 3 Dragon Tree markers in the back row. And if you get rid of a Magnolia from your wherever basically, as long as it's a different name one, gives your Vanguard the skill that every time your back row rear guard attacks a Vanguard, you get to retire an opponent's rear guard. So usually just use that once just to get rid of your opponent's field. And basically this deck wants to go really fast. You also have the set 12 double rare Force Draw Dragon that just basically lets you revive your entire board equal to how many Dragon Tree markers you have. This is another one of those decks from the previous set, but it did get a bit of support with that new common, so that's why I wanted to feature it. And that is going to be it for this best decks of set 13 meta analysis. I hope that now you can finish up your tournaments for the year on a successful note. And of course, this was a more in-depth look at all the different decks and kind of just trying to feature as much as possible. I had to cut out some of the decks that I didn't see perform as well, like Prison, that despite getting really good promos as well as set 12 support, just kind of got bodied by Bastion a bit too hard to be able to stand on their own. So I hope this look at all the different decks was insightful. I'm going to be doing another video for set 13 going over the top 10 decks of this format, really embracing that kind of like power ranking style video for once. So I hope you do look forward to that. And of course, let me know in the comments below what decks you are building from this set, if you'd make any changes to these lists, and any suggestions for what other cards you can add to these decks with the new addition of 4 extra cards to the main deck from January 19th. As always, if you liked the video, please do give it a like, and if you haven't already, please do subscribe. It really helps the channel a lot. If you want some bonus content or to unlock some of the content early, consider becoming a YouTube channel member. It really helps to support the channel. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.